Australia's military history is more than just a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who have answered the call of their country of birth or adoption and the enduring legacy they have created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History, a Doc Network podcast. Now let's get started. Welcome to part 4 of the life, service and legacy of Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honner, but before we continue, a few announcements. Now, I've been going back over the older episodes and improving the audio quality, which has actually coincided with YouTube having releasing podcasting on their platform. So if you'd like a different way to consume the podcast with the potential of video podcasts in the future, follow the link in the show notes, and as a reminder, also follow the podcast for additional content on all our socials at IWODMJ. And follow the invite link to join us on Discord. With that out of the way, let's continue. Ralph Honner was born on the 17th of August 1904 as Hyacinth Ralph Honner, named in honor of St. Hyacinth of Poland, the patron saint of those in danger of drowning, whose feast day shares his birth. Working as both a lawyer and a teacher, he joined the Australian Imperial Force as part of the original allotment of the 2nd 11th Australian Infantry Battalion and served throughout the battalion's initial involvement in the North African Campaign, including in the captures of Tobruk and Bardia, and also served as a commander of rearguard actions in the disastrous campaigns in Greece and the fall of Crete. We join him now on the mountains of Papua at noon on the 16th of August 1942, just outside the small town of Alola, where, as the interim commander of Maroubra Force, the ad hoc infantry unit comprised of militia and indigenous infantry units, he ordered the 53rd Australian Infantry Battalion, a militia unit he'd been travelling with, to secure the approaches between Alola and Ishirava to ensure an evacuation route back down the trail. An hour later, Honner entered Ishirava proper and took command of the 39th Australian Militia Battalion of the Citizens Military Force. A force that as soon as Honner saw it wrote after the war that, quote, physically, the pathetically young warriors of the 39th were in poor shape. Worn out by strenuous fighting and exhausting movement and weakened by lack of food and sleep and shelter, many of them had literally come to a standstill, unquote. These men were definitely not the same hand-picked worldly Kalgoorlie miners or Great Southern farmers in their mid to late 20s that Honner had hand-selected for the 2nd 11th Battalion. These men had not received the disciplined training at home before extensive training overseas that Honner's old C Company did, who he had drilled to become the best company in the 19th Australian Infantry Brigade that held the line in Greece and Crete. The men of the 39th also missed out on the public's appreciation of being members of the Australian Imperial Force. The 39th Australian Militia Battalion had been raised hastily as part of the Citizens Military Force and sent as part of the garrison force to the newly established 8th Military District of Papua in response to the fall of Singapore, the Philippines, and the Japanese bombing of Darwin. While most of the 39th senior officers were veterans of the First World War, the bulk of the unit was comprised of 18 to 19-year-olds from around the Kew and Hawthorn areas of Melbourne, who had only a few months of experience within the militia, where the unit had been originally raised as a motorised unit before it had been rated as not completed their training before being sent to the most threatened area equipped with material not deemed suitable for overseas service. Because the unit had been raised so rapidly, by their own admission, they hadn't been professionally trained, which quickly garnered them the moniker of Chocos, short for Chocolate Soldiers by men of the Australian Imperial Force. The term chocolate soldier originally came from George Bernard Shaw's 1894 play Arms and the Man and referred to a soldier who would not fight but looked good in a uniform. For the militia, this name came from the fact that while they had a higher rate of pay than the men of the AIF and had all the trappings of soldiers, due to Section 51 of the 1903 Defence Act, which prohibited established military units from leaving Australia and her territories, it inferred that they were simply for show, and if they did actually fight, they would melt under the pressure. Now, this is despite the fact that they were the only forces still holding the line against the Japanese, as the 8th Division Australian Imperial Force had surrendered, and the remainder of the AIF was in the process of being relocated and retrained from their service in North Africa. While the term has become synonymous with the militia, the term didn't actually originate with them, as members of the AIF who arrived after the Gallipoli Campaign in the First World War also gained the moniker. In addition to this unwanted term of endearment, a fifth of the men of the 39th had also gained the worst possible military stigma. They had been branded cowards by Honner's new executive officer and predecessor, Major Alan Cameron, formerly Brigade Major of the 30th Brigade, which the 39th was a part of. This unfair tiring came from the fact that B Company had been the initial unit sent across the Owen Stanley Ranges to secure Kokoda, where it then proceeded to participate in a disastrous initial campaign with the Japanese and had been forced to withdraw back up the Owen Stanley Ranges to Ishirava. Major Cameron went so far as to suggest to Honner that he disband the entire company and disperse the men throughout the rest of the unit for what was essentially the actions of a select few. Honner, having seen the horrors of the North African campaign and the disastrous Greek and Crete campaigns, where he watched his beloved 2nd 11th be decimated, knew that he had to make a decision, and quickly. In a 1986 interview, Honner stated, quote, "They were the only troops I had. I had to make them as good as possible. They wouldn't have been well received in the companies they were sent to, coming with that reputation. I thought I couldn't afford to lose a company. I went there with the job of holding the Japs, and this is what I had to hold them with. They were my troops, and we were going to do the best we could," unquote. Honner called a company commander's conference as soon as he took command, and after consulting with the more experienced officers of the militia, appointed militia officer Lieutenant Bevan French to take command of B Company, and the following day, on Honner's 38th birthday, he rearranged his battalion to make better use of the natural defences of Ishirava. Ishirava is a village in a clearing on the first main peak of the Owen Stanleys, on the southern trail back from Kokoda, and as Honner put it, it was, quote, "as good as a delaying position as could be found on the main track," unquote. Ishirava itself is situated south of the village of Daniki, north of Olola, and east of Naro. To its east, the high ground falls steeply towards the fast-flowing Aurora Creek, which sits at the bottom of a steep ravine. Overlooked by the ridge to the north, Ishirava is ultimately unsuited to defensive operations, as that northeastern ridge offered Japanese artillery the ability to range their own fire indiscriminately down onto the Australian positions with impunity, as the Australians lacked any means of countering it. The Japanese had two alternatives to attacking Ishirava. The first was to advance along the eastern side of the Iora Valley and bypass Ishirava by Aburari. The second was to attack along the ridgeline to the west from Naro to Olola. Both of these options offered the Japanese an easy avenue of advance around the flank towards the Australian rear, which is why Honner ordered the 53rd to fortify the village. While these routes were safer and would bypass Ishirava, and while a frontal assault against the 39th wasn't ideal, this attack did offer the Japanese the advantage of securing movement, communication, and supply lines towards Port Moresby without the added expenditures of having to deal with enemy troop movements in their rear or expend more time and resources cutting new tracks through the jungle. This is what Honner was anticipating when he arrayed his battalion to cover all three potential attack routes along the trail. He focused the bulk of his force with B Company in command of the killing field, with D and E companies in support of the flanks facing the thick scrub and timber plantations on the most direct attack route along the trail. This plan was to ensure the B Company would, quote, "regain its honour," unquote, in the eyes of the rest of the battalion. Honner knew that his position wasn't a bastion. It was simply a holding action to delay the Japanese advance long enough until elements of the 7th Australian Infantry Division made their way up the trail to relieve them. During this initial phase, his command style was immediately noticed, as noted by his adjutant, Lieutenant Lovett. Quote, "He was always a perfect gentleman, no matter what the situation. He didn't lose his temper, he didn't show disgust. A very easy person to work with. You could rely on what he said was going to happen, and he'd give you confidence to go on and do it. He made the war his war, and he knew what he wanted," unquote. It should be noted that this was the first time since the 39th had been raised that the whole unit was in the same location during the Kokoda Campaign. After receiving embarkation orders on the 3rd of August, the 7th Australian Infantry Division headed to Papua. The 18th Brigade was sent to Milne Bay, the 21st Brigade was sent to Port Moresby, and the 25th was held in Queensland in reserve as the situation evolved. And as Honner clambered up the Kokoda Trail to assume command of the 39th, the 21st Brigade was landing in Papua, and with them was Brigadier General Arnold Potts, the new commanding officer of Maroubra Force, and they made their way slowly up the trail. However, due to supply issues, it wasn't until the 19th that Potts would formally take command of Maroubra Force, with orders to retake Kokoda. On the 21st of August, he would inform Honner that relief was making its way up the trail in the form of the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions. All he had to do was hold the line until then. Honner ordered his battalion to continue aggressive patrolling within the jungle and to prepare defensive positions in depth for the inevitable Japanese assault, making full use of the Japanese delay to better prepare. However, he wouldn't have long to wait. The Japanese simultaneously attacked his forward platoons in force and commenced artillery shelling within Ishirava from the heights just before noon on the 25th of August. While this initial attack was repulsed, all across his line, the Japanese continued their probing attacks in preparation for the main battle commencing the following morning. Brigadier Potts, realizing that the Japanese had launched a major attack, ordered Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Key in the 2nd 14th to Isarava. And it was here that Honner's experience in North Africa against the Italians had started to pay off. When the Japanese mountain guns started firing onto Honner's positions in Isarava, his adjutant, Lieutenant Lovett, noticed, quote, "We were standing out in the open, Ralph Honner and I don't know who else was there, probably an officer or two, and we were talking about what we were going to do. And a mountain gun, they were ranging onto us. When the first shot landed, we all looked around to see what Ralph was going to do. You could hear the preliminary shot fired from the gun and you knew the shell would land within, say, 5 seconds. He was looking at us, and the bloody thing landed fairly close to us, and he said, 'Look, there's no point in us just standing around when the bombardment's going on,' he said. 'We're only going to get ourselves hurt here. What I'm going to do when we hear the preliminary shot fired is I'm going to ground, and I think you'll serve me well if you go to ground with me.' So we were waiting for a move from him, because we didn't want to let him think that we were bloody frightened," unquote. Reinforcements from the 2nd 14th would arrive during the course of the day, much to the relief of Honner and the rest of the outnumbered 39th, as the unit was suffering from 3 platoons cut off behind Japanese lines, and those that remained started to become affected by the trio of tropical afflictions: dysentery, malaria, and malnutrition, an enemy that attacked both sides, something that was highlighted in the title of Freddie Spencer Chapman's book, The Jungle Was Neutral. There was a third enemy on Papua that both the Allies and the Japanese had to face, and that was the terrain and the myriad of flora and fauna that inhabited it. While this was happening, Japanese General Tomitaro Horai was also attacking the 53rd Battalion at Arubare along that eastern secondary track in an attempt to cut off and isolate the Australians at Isarava, while also launching probing attacks along the western ridgeline. This attack also coincided with the Japanese attack on Milne Bay at the southern tip of Papua, which split the ready Allied response in two. The ensuing Battle of Isarava commenced on the night of the 26th, with the 39th taking the brunt of the initial attack before sufficient reinforcements on the 2nd 14th arrived. During this crucial period, Honner showed his leadership as remembered by Lieutenant Lovett. Quote, "Oh God, he was strong. He'd have a smile on his face. He'd always have a little bit of a grin. He was trying to relax himself, I guess. He was very settled in every way. He could have been scared like hell inside, but he didn't show it on the outside," unquote. It also became apparent during the battle that Honner was a man of routine. During the entire defense at Isarava, Honner maintained constant contact with his signallers to keep Brigadier Potts appraised of what was going on, his company runners, the battalion's padre, and regimental medical officer. And when the battle permitted, he toured the front line and held conferences with his company commanders. Now, this wasn't always possible, even though the defensive perimeter was only about 150 metres around Isarava. During the ensuing battle, B Company had its chance to redeem itself as they, along with E Company, held the open ground and took a heavy toll on the Japanese. But this was a war of attrition, more akin to the battles on the Western Front than the war of maneuver and movement of the Second World War. And as mentioned in Honner's book, The 39th at Isarava, quote, "They held fighting magnificently, while the enemy came on in reckless waves, regardless of the casualties that soon cluttered that short stretch of open ground. These incessant assaults were slowly sapping B Company's strength, and at the end of the day, when the heaviest attack all rolled over them, their endurance was stretched to breaking point. It was reported that they were unlikely to hold much longer unless reinforced. I recognized that it would only be a matter of time before our small garrison was overrun," unquote. Relief would arrive in the afternoon of the 27th in the form of Captain Claude Nye and B Company 2nd 14th, who quickly impressed Honner with their professionalism. Quote, "I do not remember anything more heartening than the sight of their confident deployment. Their splendid physique and bearing and their cool efficiency, even the assembly line touch as 2 platoon mortarmen stepped on either side of the track to pluck bombs from the haversacks of the riflemen flying past without even checking their pace," unquote. Brigadier Potts would then order Honner and the 39th to occupy positions on the Nauru Ridgeline to the west of Isarava to try and block the Japanese flanking operation there. Unfortunately, those troops would be quickly cut off from the main Australian force and would have to make their own way back to friendly lines. On the 28th of August, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Key, commanding officer of the 2nd 14th, arrived at Isarava and assumed command of the region. In doing so, he relieved the 39th to allow them a chance to rest. However, Honner drew on his experience on Greece and Crete and knew what was coming, and in conference with Key, Honner made his vision clear, quote, I considered the holding of Isarava against the strength of the enemy had shown the previous day would need more than one battalion, and I would not leave him in the lurch," unquote. Instead of falling back, Honner rotated his men to rear positions and into the gaps in the line to support the AIF men. A request for reinforcements was made, but all available troops had been put into the line, and Brigadier Potts ordered C Company of the 53rd to move forward, who went as far as the Isarava rest house, or roughly halfway between Alola and Isarava, and then set up camp there, much to the chagrin and annoyance of the men at Isarava. Reinforcements, however, would arrive, but it wouldn't be in the strength Key wanted, but their presence was a welcome morale boost. The 3 cut-off platoons that had been ordered to secure Naru Ridge reported to Alola, after a day and a half of hard mountain fighting, hurried back to form a reserve for Key, although they were hungry and sick. A soldier on the 2nd 16th reported that seeing them was, quote, "It was enough to make a man weep to see these poor skinny bastards hobble in on their bleeding feet, turn around and go straight back to Isarava. I knew they were good," unquote. They were informed that the 39th and the 2nd 14th were fighting for their lives, and without a word or thought of food or medical attention that they all needed, they turned and hurried as fast as their battered bodies would carry them to relieve their brothers. The other contingent of reinforcements were called in the 39th's war diary as the fittest of the unfit. Honner had ordered Lieutenant Johnson to take the weakest of the battalion's sick and start making their way back towards Port Moresby, to give them enough of a head start for the inevitable withdrawal. When word reached them of what was happening, Johnson reported, quote, "We heard the battalion was in trouble, so we came back," unquote. Honner was surprised to see these grimy, bearded scarecrows of men who he wrote were, quote, "fit for the hospital, yet worthy for Valhalla. Key had a reserve again," unquote. These acts meant that the line at Isarava now had 4 times the number of men as Honner had when he initially took command, and the 2nd 14th also brought mortars with them, something that would allow them to finally respond to the Japanese artillery. But sadly, these men were exhausted, physically unwell, and run ragged. They were slowly being beaten down. While Honner and Key were barely holding the line at Isarava, their lines were breaking under repeated Japanese attacks. Concurrently, the 53rd had been forced back to Alola on the 27th, having lost Arabare, which directly threatened the force at Isarava. And even though they had been ordered to retake Mishima on the trail back towards Asagari, the unit failed to meet its objectives. Don't worry, I'll include a map as there are a lot of A-Town words on the Kokoda Trail. Unfortunately, there's also been a lot said about the conduct of the 53rd during the course of this battle, and none of it, sadly, is positive. After 4 days of hard fighting, on the 29th of August, Lieutenant Colonel Key reported to Brigadier Potts that he could no longer hold Isarava, and requested to be allowed to withdraw to the Isarava rest house. Potts agreed, and the 2 battalions dug into their new positions during the late hours of the 29th. Fortunately, General Tomotaru Horai's decision to not exploit the complete collapse of the 53rd on the 27th of August and effectively cut off the forces at Isarava was a short-lived blessing. While it did allow for the wounded to be evacuated and supplies and reinforcements rushed forward, it wouldn't last, as on the 30th, General Horai's weary veteran troops would be reinforced by fresh troops from the 41st Infantry Regiment Group who would continue the attack. At midday, the wounded and unwell from Isarava force were withdrawn towards Maiola, leaving Honner with about 150 officers and men, plus what remained of the 2nd 14th. This was not enough to hold the position, so at 3 p.m, Brigadier Potts ordered a general withdrawal to Aurora Creek, further to the south. As the forces holding the Arabare track to the east had already been withdrawn, and Honner and his men were at risk of being cut off for a second time in 5 days. Honner led a small headquarters unit towards Aurora Creek. Brigadier Potts had ordered that the 39th and 53rd would be the first to be withdrawn, while the comparatively fresher 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th would hold the line and participate in a fighting withdrawal. When Honner arrived on the 31st of August with his headquarters and the first batch of the wounded, the 53rd had not yet arrived, and considering the comparatively low opinion of the unit at the time to the rest of the Maroubra force, Honner organised the defence of Aurora Creek, solely using the men under his command until the AIF troops arrived to take over. To facilitate this, Honner took what remained of his 5 companies and amalgamated them into 2 composite companies and took up positions at Templeton's Crossing. At 1800 hours, the 2nd 14th and the 21st Brigade headquarters slowly made their way to Aurora. They took up positions to the rear of the 39th, but sadly, Lieutenant Colonel Key was not with them. Heavy Japanese fire had forced him to seek cover off the trail. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Samuel Key, who had a comparatively low X number like Honner did, and served throughout the entirety of the North African campaign like Honner did, would be captured by the Japanese. He would be interrogated and then executed by his captors on the 10th of September 1942, age 36. While Honner was at Isarava, Australian news media crews arrived at Aurora. Chester Wilmot from the ABC, Osmar White from the Melbourne Sun and Daily Telegraph, and cameraman Damien Pera from the Australian Department of Information, a name you might recall from the life, service and legacy of Frank Hurley. Brigadier Potts was now in a very tenuous position. He was severely outnumbered and again in danger of being outflanked. As the 2nd 16th entered Aurora, he ordered Honner and the 39th further down the trail to Kagi. Honner's orders were simple: get to Kagi and reinforce it before the Japanese got there first and cut them off. All this was recorded by Damien Pera, who shot video of the withdrawal and has the only footage taken on Kokoda. I'll share it on the podcast social feeds. On the 2nd of September, Honner and the bulk of his battalion arrived in Kagi, and reinforced by rear echelon personnel and convalescing men, dug in around Kagi and waited for the rest of Maroubra Force. The following day, the United States Army Air Force entered the battle, by way of 4 P-39 Air Cobras dive-bombing the Australian positions. Thankfully, there were no casualties, but I imagine more than a few colourful phrases were thrown back at them. The 4th of September saw fresh Australian troops in the form of the 2nd 27th Australian Infantry Battalion enter the line, and on the 5th they started to take over the 39th positions as Honner and what remained of Maroubra Force were withdrawn to Minari on Mitten Ridge. In doing so, the survivors of the 39th handed over their weapons, rations and medical supplies to the newcomers. It was at this point that Honner would be reunited with Damien Pera, as the 2 journalists he accompanied had returned to Port Moresby to lodge their stories. Pera had decided to stay at Aurora and then followed the 39th back, and instead of imposing on the beleaguered survivors, he was seen throwing the heavy cans of film stock and other journalistic equipment he had carried into the creek to lighten his own load. It was in this meeting that the photo that I've been using in this series on Honner was taken, as the 2 had previously met following the capture of Derna, where Pera had actually asked Honner to use his men to recreate the attack for propaganda footage. Pera followed the withdrawal to Minari and was responsible for taking most of the photos one associates with the Kokoda Campaign, including stretcher cases being taken down the trail by Papuan porters, all while battling dysentery, but his story is for another day. On the 6th of September, Honner ordered Lieutenant Lovett to put what remained of his battalion on parade. Considering his first opinion of the men as mentioned at the start of the episode, when compared to his beloved 2nd 11th, the following told of their shared experiences he had. Quote, "I'd like them to know that I think that they're some of the best soldiers that I've had anything to do with, and they've got no fears of being able to hold their heads up," unquote. According to the soldiers present, Honner's speech bared a number of similarities to the St. Crispin's Day speech in Henry V. That's the "we few, we happy few, we band of brothers" speech. This whole parade was captured by Pera, and it was unique as it comprised of only 50 soldiers, all in varying states of undressed, exhausted, waxen faces, and most without weapons save for the Kokoda Trail walking stick. I'll include the photo on the social pages as well. The officer in front of the formation is Lieutenant Johnson. Honner also passed on the commendation of Brigadier General Potts that, quote, "their efforts represented gallantry, courage, and the fortitude of the highest order, and their fighting prowess was inspiration to all who saw it," unquote. Following this, the 39th continued down the trail through Nauru, Irabare, Ubare, Owes Corner, which is at the beginning of the trail, and then the remaining 8 kilometers to the Koitaki camp, 30 kilometers from Port Moresby. In total, 60 men of the 39th would be buried on and around the Kokoda Trail, and 125 would be wounded. And in doing so, they helped to create the Kokoda legend, though contemporarily it was anything but. On arrival at Koitaki on the 9th of September 1942, they were issued with clean clothes, mail and comforts funds packages, which included tobacco, soap and razor blades. On the 11th of September, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honner would be ordered to report to New Guinea Force Headquarters in Port Moresby. While there, he met with Commander-in-Chief Australian Military Forces, General Sir Thomas Blamey, and was appointed to command the newly raised Honner Force, a 500-man unit designed to check possible Japanese movement along the Goldie River. And if he didn't encounter the Japanese, he was to continue up the river and cut Japanese supply lines between Nauru and Minari. The issue was that due to the unsuitability of means of evacuation or resupply, Honner was restricted to travelling as far as his rations and supplies would allow him, which meant his special operation lasted about 6 days. Little is known about the actual specifics of Honor Force. It's only mentioned in passing in all official documents, and the unit itself didn't have a war diary or official reports. And Honor himself considered the whole operation, quote, a bloody stupid idea, unquote. Though through my interpretation, this kind of operation, while a bloody stupid idea in 1942, would be routinely conducted in Vietnam and in more modern conflicts by trained, dedicated Special Forces personnel, not the largely inexperienced, unmotivated militia conscripts that Honor had been assigned. Honor, the newly promoted Captain Lovett, and Lieutenant McNamara, the battalion intelligence officer, would return to the 39th Battalion on the 1st of October to find the unit in defensive positions around Port Moresby as they continued on taking on reinforcements and training up. This included 100 men from the now disgraced 53rd Battalion. The rest of the unit was now relegated to work details in the port itself. They would stay there until November, when they were reassigned to the 21st Brigade. They would remain out of the line until the 29th of November, when they were issued green uniforms and American-styled gaiters and received orders to prepare to move. The following day, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honner, his intelligence officer, his RMO, Captain Shearer, and portions of C and D companies boarded planes for Popondetta for the battalion's involvement in the Kokoda Campaign, which will be the topic of the next episode of the I Was Only Doing My Job Australia's Military History podcast. So catch you next time, friends. Bye. Works cited in this episode are Ralph Honner, Kokoda Hero by Peter Bruin, The Battle for Australia, The Miracle of Kokoda by Captain W.H.J. Phillips, He's Not Coming South, The Invasion That Wasn't by Peter Stanley, The Australian Militia at War, 1939-1945 by James Morrison, The Making and Breaking of the Post-Federation Australian Army, 1900-1909 by Craig Stockings, The Official History of the Australia's Involvement in the Second World War, The Service Record of Ralph Honner, The War Diary of the 39th Australian Militia Battalion, the website of the 39th Battalion Association, and the website of the Australian War Memorial. Thanks for listening to the I Was Only Doing My Job Australia's Military History podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Gangdangara people whose elders have passed on knowledge for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This episode was written, researched, produced, directed, and audio engineered by me, Ross, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. If you do know someone whose story needs to be told, feel free to leave a comment on an episode or send us an email at iwasonlydoingmyjobpod@gmail.com. If you like what we do here and you want to support this podcast, the best thing you can do is share this with a friend or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, as it really helps others find the show. And if you want to join in on the conversation, join us over on Discord, and if you want more content including show notes, photos, transcripts, and my various adventures finding memorials dotted around Australia, head over to our website at www.thedocnetwork.net and follow the show on all our social media pages at IWODMJ. Don't worry, there are links to everything in the show notes. Join me personally for more bite-sized history over on TikTok and pretty much everywhere else at Doc Winters. All opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not reflect the views or opinions of any entity, agency, or organization. It is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time. Bye.